He didn't buy a bride for love, just someone to chase off the silence. But silence wasn't the only thing haunting that house. And she wasn't just a bride. She came with her own ghosts and her own fire. Together, they'd face what neither dared alone. The stagecoach groaned as it halted, kicking dust across the parched yard. Thomas Avery stood on the porch, boots planted, arms crossed, hat low against the late sun. He didn't move as the driver climbed down or as the woman stepped out, blinking against the light like someone surfacing from deep water. Her dress was creased from the ride, her bonnet slightly askew, and in her hands she held a small, worn bag that looked heavier than it should have. She was younger than he'd expected, early 20s maybe, and thinner too, like someone who knew more of hunger than comfort. But her chin was lifted, and her eyes, dark, steady, met his without flinching. "I'm a leaner," she said simply. He gave a nod, slow and silent, and held the door open. Not a word of welcome, not a smile, just a gesture stiff and practiced, like this was a chore long overdue. Inside, the house was neat but hollow. The floors were scrubbed, the walls clean, the hearth swept, but it all felt untouched, unlived in. Eleanor's eyes swept across the room. A single chair pulled close to the fire, a mantel with no photos, and a table set for one. "You live alone," she said, more a statement than a question. Thomas closed the door behind her. "I do." "And now you don't," she added softly, setting down her bag. He looked at her then properly. There was something in the way she stood still, almost guarded, but not afraid, not uncertain. She hadn't come to be coddled or courted. She'd come because she'd agreed to, because he'd sent the money and the letter and she'd answered. A paper bride, a stranger with his last name already stitched into the hem of her intentions. "I sleep in the room to the right," Thomas said, nodding toward the hall. "Yours is across the way. You'll find a basin, fresh sheets. I'll fix supper." Eleanor didn't ask what or where or why. She simply picked up her bag again and disappeared down the hall. The silence returned. It wasn't always like this, Thomas had once told himself. There had been laughter here, once. A piano that hadn't been touched in 4 years. A girl with copper curls and a laugh that clung to the rafters. A wife who died with a fever and a child still inside her. That was before the letters went out. Before hope had turned into something more practical, more grim. He hadn't sent for love, he'd sent for presence. Someone to fill the space, to set plates for two, to make the walls stop echoing. That night they ate in silence. She didn't complain about the saltless stew or the coarse bread. He didn't ask about the bruise just below her collarbone or the way her hand trembled when she reached for the spoon. They didn't speak of the past. They didn't speak much at all. But when Eleanor went to her room, she locked the door. And Thomas noticed. The days passed in slow, cautious rhythm. She rose before dawn, fixed the fire, boiled water. She never waited for him to ask. She cleaned what was already clean, mended clothes that weren't hers, and cooked meals he barely touched. She kept to herself, but not from fear. There was a purpose to her silence, a weight behind her eyes, like she carried something too precious or too broken to put down. Thomas watched her, quietly, respectfully, like someone watching a wild animal that had chosen to stay but could bolt at any second. He noticed how she flinched when boots scuffed too loud on floorboards, how she jerked awake at thunder, how her eyes never wandered to the piano in the parlor, like she was punishing herself with its absence. It was on the 7th morning that he found her outside before dawn, staring up at the barn. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. "You looking for something?" he asked, voice low. Eleanor didn't turn. "I heard something last night, movement." "Coyotes probably," he replied. She shook her head slowly, too heavy, too slow. He stepped past her and opened the barn door wider. It was dim inside but quiet. No overturned feed, no broken boards. Just hay, still damp from the last rain, and tools hung in neat rows. But something was off. One of the horses, Mabel, was snorting, her ears pinned. "You keep that one in the corner?" Eleanor asked, stepping inside now. She's temperamental, Thomas said. She's scared, Alina replied. They both heard it then, a soft clink, metal chain. Thomas moved fast, pulling open the storage stall in the far back. And there, curled behind the feed sacks, was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 12. Gaunt, filthy, shackles on his ankles, half buried in straw. His eyes were wild, but he didn't bolt, didn't scream. He just looked at them like he'd been expecting someone, anyone, but hoping for no one. Thomas backed up, jaw tight. What the hell? Alina knelt slowly, carefully. It's okay, she whispered. You're safe now. The boy flinched when her hand reached out, but then slowly he leaned into it. Thomas stood frozen. That boy wasn't here yesterday. He was, Alina said quietly. We just didn't know where to look. What is he doing on my land? Thomas asked, his voice tight with disbelief. But the boy only whispered one word, Harlan. Alina's face went white. You know that name? Thomas asked. She nodded once. Harlan Bishop. He runs freight 2 counties east, hires kids, then they disappear. Thomas looked again at the boy, at the chains, the bruises, the way he didn't cry even now. Something twisted hard in his chest. Rage, pity, a memory he didn't want. We need to get those off, Alina said. Now. The rest of the morning blurred. The chains were rusted but breakable. The boy didn't speak again, just followed Alina with wide, haunted eyes. She washed his feet, wrapped the worst of the sores, gave him half her supper, and sat beside him long after Thomas had gone quiet. By nightfall, the house had changed again. The silence was different now, fuller, heavier. There was a secret under that roof now, a danger that hadn't come from within but could knock on the door any hour. And it did. 2 nights later, just after dark, boots crunched outside. Not 1 pair, not 2, at least 5. Thomas was at the window before the knock came. He didn't need to see the faces. He already knew. Alina had the boy behind her. You don't open that door, she said, voice sharp. Not unless you're ready to bury someone. Thomas looked at her then. Really looked. At the woman he'd brought to fill an empty house, to pour coffee and say nothing. But she was more than that. And whatever she'd been running from, she wasn't running now. The knock came again. Thomas stepped forward. The knock came again, louder this time, impatient, heavy with the kind of authority men only carried when they knew they weren't going to be refused. Thomas didn't flinch. He looked to Alina, standing between the hearth and the boy, her shoulders squared and face pale but set. There was no fear in her eyes now, just fury, steady and silent. She didn't need to say anything more. The decision was his, and he made it. He turned back toward the door, grabbed the Winchester from above the mantel and cocked it slow. The sound cracked through the cabin like a warning. He opened the door just enough to look out. The man at the front wore a tan coat, stained with sweat and travel, and a crooked smile that said he'd never had to knock more than once in his life. Behind him, 4 others stood spaced across the yard, hands near weapons, eyes sharp. Even in, the man said, tilting his head like they were old friends. Lookin' for something that belongs to us. Thomas kept the door half blocked with his shoulder. Funny, don't remember talkin' anything that wasn't mine. The man chuckled. That's so. Thing is, there's a boy, skinny, dark hair, little wild in the eyes, went missing not too long ago. Last seen headed this direction. Runaways tend to run, Thomas said coolly. Ain't illegal to be scared and fast on your feet. The man's smile vanished. You seen him or not? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he glanced behind him. Alina stood unmoving. The boy, Jacob, they'd learned, was crouched behind her, eyes flicking toward the light under the door. He wasn't shaking. That was the worst part. He wasn't scared anymore because he already knew what these men could do. Not sure why you're out here, Thomas said slowly, turning back. But if you're looking to cause trouble, I suggest you pick another house. The man's hand slid to his belt. You sure about that? Thomas didn't flinch, dead sure. A beat passed, then 2. The man sneered but stepped back. Storm's common, he said. Might get stuck out here longer than you want." "We've got shelter," Thomas replied. "You don't." And with that he shut the door. The click of the lock echoed through the cabin. Alina exhaled, but it wasn't relief. "They'll be back," she said. Thomas nodded. "I know." That night no one slept. Not truly. Jacob curled up on the floor near the fire, Alina beside him, her hand resting over his like a tether. Thomas sat in the chair by the window, rifle across his lap, watching shadows shift with the wind. Outside, the men didn't ride off. They lit a fire in the field and waited, watching. By morning, the sky had turned steel gray. No snow, but the promise of it, cold enough to stiffen fingers and shorten tempers. Alina moved around the kitchen with quiet purpose, heating water, slicing what little meat remained. Her hands never stopped moving. She didn't ask what they would do. She didn't need to. She already knew what kind of men those were. She had seen enough to understand the shape of danger before it entered the room. As they ate, Jacob finally spoke. "If I go," he whispered, "they might leave you alone." "No," Alina said before Thomas could. "No more running." "They'll hurt you." Alina met his eyes. "We've already been hurt, that's why we fight now." Jacob didn't argue again. By midday the men approached. No knock this time, just boots on wood and fists slamming against the door. Thomas stood. Alina stepped forward too. "I'm not letting them take him," she said. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. He opened the door before they could break it down. This time the man didn't smile. He pushed his way forward but stopped short when he saw the rifle aimed center mass. "This is your last chance," the man snapped. "You give us the boy or we take him." "You try," Thomas said. "I bury you here." The standoff lasted seconds, but it felt like hours. The men behind him shifted, unsure. It was one thing to threaten a child, another to threaten a man who didn't bluff. The leader took a step back. "You don't know who you're messing with," he growled. Thomas stepped forward, letting the barrel of the rifle press against the man's chest. "I don't care." The man stared at him for a long, hard moment. Then finally he spat on the ground and turned. "This ain't over." Thomas waited until they were gone, until the sound of hooves faded completely, before he lowered the rifle. "Should have shot him," Alina muttered. Thomas looked at her. "You always been like this." She didn't smile. "No, life made me." She didn't explain further. She didn't have to. The next 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. Jacob spoke more now, little things, his favorite food, the horse he'd once seen in a book, the brother he hadn't seen in years. He stayed close to Alina, watching her hands as she worked, mimicking how she folded sheets or stirred soup. He didn't flinch anymore when Thomas entered the room. He stood straighter, trusted more. Thomas noticed the way Alina watched the boy, not like a mother exactly, but like someone who understood what it meant to be broken young. Like she saw herself in him, or someone she used to be. That night, Alina sat on the porch long after Jacob had fallen asleep. Thomas joined her without a word. The stars were sharp overhead, the cold making every sound clearer. "I was married before," she said suddenly. Thomas didn't speak. "He died," she added, "but not before doing enough damage to last a lifetime." Thomas turned to her slightly. "Not all at once," she continued. "Little things, first the names, then the rules, then the bruises. I left one morning before dawn, took nothing but what I could carry, figured I'd die on the road, but dying free was better than living like that." Thomas stared out across the yard. "You're not dying," he said finally. "No," she said, "but I didn't expect to live either." Another silence passed, not uncomfortable, just real. "Why me?" he asked. "Why say yes to the letter?" She looked at him then. "Because you didn't write like a man looking for a servant. You wrote like someone trying to breathe again." Thomas swallowed. "Maybe I was." Alina nodded. "We both were." Inside, Jacob stirred in his sleep, murmuring something inaudible. Neither moved. They just listened. like guardians of a space that had finally, if briefly, known peace. But peace doesn't last. Just before dawn, Thomas found blood near the barn, fresh, dark, a rope cut clean and a bootprint too large to be his. He followed it to the field, to the spot where the fire had once burned, and found nothing, not even ash. He came back to the house with a storm on his face. "We've got a problem," he told Eleanor. She didn't ask, she only grabbed her coat. The front window had been cracked, small, deliberate, a message. "They want us scared," she said. Thomas shook his head. "They want us divided." That evening, Eleanor took Jacob into town with the wagon, public, visible, surrounded. A show of strength. Thomas stayed behind to watch the property. They split, not from distrust, but from necessity, from strategy. But while Eleanor bought supplies, a stranger bumped into her. No apology, no eye contact. Just a folded piece of paper slipped into her hand and a voice that didn't match the face. "They know where the boy came from. They know you're hiding him. Run." Eleanor turned, but the man was gone. She returned to the cabin pale and trembling, not from fear, but rage. "They've got eyes everywhere," she said. Thomas nodded. "Then it's time we stop hiding." That night they prepared, not just weapons but exits, not just food but maps. Jacob helped too, tying bags, learning how to listen for danger. "This isn't just about you anymore," Eleanor told the boy gently. "It's about everyone they hurt." The next morning the cabin was quiet, too quiet. Thomas opened the barn door to feed the horses and froze. Jacob was gone. In his place, a scrap of paper. "Trade one for the rest." The note was scrawled in a jagged, almost mocking hand. "Trade one for the rest." No signature, no instructions, just those 5 words and the sick certainty of what they meant. Thomas read it once, then again, as if repetition would change the ink or erase the hollow forming in his chest. The barn was silent. No scuffle, no signs of forced entry, just absence. Deliberate and cruel. Jacob was gone and he hadn't cried out, hadn't woken them, hadn't fought. Which meant someone knew exactly how to take him without waking the house. Thomas walked back toward the cabin, fists clenched, rage simmering beneath his skin like a storm warming to boil. Eleanor was already on the porch, eyes searching his face. She didn't ask, just stepped forward and took the note from his hand. Her lips moved as she read, her expression hardening with every word. "We leave now," she said flatly. Thomas didn't argue. The time for debating was over. He saddled the horses while she packed what little they needed, blankets, water, bread, the rifle. No hesitation, no fear, just movement. Eleanor rode hard beside him, her bonnet trailing back in the wind, her eyes locked on the distant trail that wound toward the ridge. Neither of them spoke for miles. They didn't need to. There was only one direction now. It was late afternoon when they found the first marker, a strip of fabric caught on a branch, blue cotton. The kind Eleanor had sewn into Jacob's coat. She didn't reach for it, just stared at it like it had betrayed her. "They're leading us," she said finally. Thomas nodded. "They want us to follow." "And we will," she replied, voice like steel. The path twisted deeper into the pines, the light thinning with every step. Eventually, they reached a small clearing, and there, on a tree stump, sat another note weighed down by a rusted horseshoe. "You wanted him safe. We gave you time. Now you come to us, alone." Thomas didn't even have to read it out loud. Eleanor was already pulling the saddlebag tighter. "They're counting on you telling me to stay." "You think I'm that stupid?" Thomas asked quietly. "I think you've lost enough already," she said. "And I think," he said, stepping closer, "that if I lose you too, I stop being who I've fought this hard to become." They moved together after that, quiet, methodical. As the sun sank behind the hills, they crept along the ridge until the glow of lanterns flickered in the dark. A small outpost, wooden fencing, half collapsed, 2 men on watch, a third inside the barn. Thomas crouched low behind a brush. Could be 5, maybe 6 inside. Eleanor scanned the area. There's a chain on the door. Middle barn, that's where they're keeping him. You take the back, Thomas said. I'll draw their eyes. Alina looked at him then, really looked. You're not trying to be noble, are you? He shook his head. Just tired of hiding behind walls. They came to my land, took a child from my home. That makes this mine. She nodded once, then vanished into the trees. Thomas waited 10 breaths, then he stepped into the clearing. He didn't shout, he didn't fire. He just walked like he had every right to be there, shoulders back, boots crunching loud. The first man spotted him and reached for his pistol. The second man froze. Thomas raised his rifle, not to shoot but to show he could. I'm only going to ask once, he called out. Bring the boy. The barn door opened, and out stepped Harlan Bishop. Tall, broad face pockmarked with years of violence and grinning with rot. He clapped slowly. Well, look at that. Husband of the year. I was wonderin' if you'd come. Thomas did lower the rifle. I'm not here to chat. No, Harlan asked, stepping forward, arms wide. Then why show up alone? I'm not, Thomas said. Before the words had even settled, a crash exploded from the back of the barn. Alina burst through a side panel, dragging Jacob by the hand. One of the men reached for her, but she turned fast, elbow cracking against his jaw. He stumbled, and Jacob ran straight into Thomas's arms. Go, Alina yelled. But Harlan lunged first. Thomas pushed Jacob behind him and fired. The shot hit Harlan's shoulder, spinning him backward with a howl. 2 more men raised their guns. Alina grabbed the dropped pistol from the stunned guard and fired wide, enough to send them scattering, enough to buy seconds. They didn't waste them. They ran. Through trees, across roots, over frozen ground. Bullets whistled past, too close to pretend it wasn't war. But they didn't stop. They ran until their lungs burned and Jacob stumbled, and then Thomas lifted him with one arm, rifle still in the other. They didn't stop until the woods thinned and the first signs of morning broke over the plains. They reached the cabin half dead. Jacob collapsed in the doorway. Alina sank to her knees beside him, brushing back his hair. You're okay, she whispered, over and over. Thomas bolted the door and dropped the rifle on the table. His hands were shaking, so was his voice. You all right? Alina looked up at him, eyes wet. He is, that's all that matters. But it wasn't over, they both knew it. Thomas took the first watch that day, sitting by the window while Alina and Jacob rested. He didn't move, didn't blink. Every time a branch creaked or wind shifted, his grip tightened. By sundown, they knew they had no choice. We can't stay, Alina said. They'll come again. I won't run forever, Thomas muttered. Then we fight. He looked at her, tired and bruised but unbroken. With what? Courage, she said, and fire. They spent the next day preparing. Booby traps, warning lines. Alina wrote a letter, short and sharp, and rode into town under cover of night. She returned with allies, 2 men who owed her favors and didn't ask questions. One was a blacksmith with a temper. The other, a preacher who had buried more innocents than he could count. Both carried guns. I told you, Alina said as Thomas raised an eyebrow. I wasn't always alone. The next night, they waited again. And this time when the footsteps came, no one froze. The cabin didn't just hold silence anymore. It held fury. It held purpose. The door would not open. The walls would not fall. And Thomas Avery, who once bought a wife because loneliness had carved a hole too wide to patch, stood ready to bleed for more than comfort. He stood ready for family. The wind howled again, but it no longer mattered, because Alina wasn't hiding anymore. She stood with the rifle aimed steady, her eyes sharp and unshaken. Outside, someone called Thomas's name. He didn't answer. They kicked the door. The trap snapped. And war began. The trap had been simple, razor wire strung low between porch posts, masked with fresh snow. The first man who tried the door never saw it coming. His scream tore through the dark like a gunshot, sharp and ragged as he dropped, clutching a calf sliced nearly to the bone. Before the others could react, Alina fired once through the wind. High, a warning not meant to kill. But it scattered them just the same, pushed them back into the tree line, reminded them they were not the only ones who came ready to fight. Thomas didn't speak as he reloaded. Alina didn't flinch when glass shattered inches from her head. They moved in unison now, no wasted movement, no fear between them. The preacher knelt by the hearth, reciting quiet prayers over the bullets he loaded with steady hands. The blacksmith crouched by the back door, a hatchet resting across his knees, face grim. Jacob, for all his trembling, sat where he'd been told, a blanket wrapped around him and Alina's locket clenched tight in his fist. "They'll try again," Thomas murmured, eye to the window. "They always do," Alina replied. And they did. A torch arced through the air, landing near the porch. Flames hissed against snow, sputtered, and died. Another followed, this one crashing against the roof. Dry wood caught fast. Smoke curled upward, thick and angry. Thomas was up the stairs before anyone spoke, slamming a bucket against the flames. Alina didn't wait. She ran for the shed out back, dodging bullets as she went, returning with the barrel of rainwater they'd saved through winter. The blacksmith joined her, teeth bared in a snarl, dousing embers before they could spread. Inside, the preacher took Alina's place at the window, firing a slow, rhythmic warning that kept the attackers ducking. "They're testing us," the blacksmith growled, "seeing how much we'll bleed before we break." "They'll find out soon enough," Alina snapped. By dawn, the attackers had pulled back. They left 2 wounded behind, one dead, the other whimpering from under the porch. Alina wanted to leave him. Thomas didn't. He dragged the man inside, bound the wounds, and tied his hands behind the beam. "You're gonna talk," he said. The man didn't answer, just spat blood and grinned. It took hours. Alina didn't have the patience Thomas did. She watched as he sat across from the man, silent, letting the weight of exhaustion and fear do most of the work. Eventually, the man broke. "Harlan's not here," he said through cracked lips. "He left, headed north to fetch more men." Thomas leaned forward. "How many?" "6, maybe 10. He's bringing hell." "Where?" The man didn't answer. Thomas rose without a word. The blacksmith took his place, rolling his sleeves. "He'll tell me," he said grimly. And he did. By sundown, Thomas and Alina knew what came next. Running wasn't an option, not anymore. They'd wounded Harlan's pride, embarrassed him, made him bleed. And men like that didn't forget. He wouldn't stop at Jacob. He'd burn everything until the land itself turned to ash. "We end this," Thomas said that night, pacing near the hearth. Alina nodded, "but on our terms." So they made a plan. It was madness, desperate and dangerous. But it was all they had. Alina knew the land better than she let on. Knew the canyon trails where ambushes worked best. Knew how to trap, how to hide signs of movement, how to leave bait where men would see it but never suspect. They moved out before dawn. Thomas and the blacksmith took the high trail, rifles ready. Alina and the preacher guided Jacob west, toward a ridge where they'd hidden a small cart and supplies, just in case. "If we fail," Alina whispered, kneeling beside Jacob, "you ride. Don't stop until you find someone with a badge or a collar." Jacob nodded, though his face had gone pale. "Will I see you again?" Alina swallowed. Yes. It wasn't a promise, not exactly, but it was close. They split at the fork, Thomas toward fire, Alina toward survival. The trap had already been set. A trail of boot prints, a dropped scarf, enough visible signs to lead Harlan's men straight into the canyon, where the land narrowed and voices echoed, where bullets found homes easier than breath. The wait was the worst part. Hours passed, cold crept in, and then hooves, dozens, shouting. Thomas raised his rifle. The ambush was brutal, not clean, not quiet, but effective. The first man went down before he knew he'd been spotted. The second got off a shot that tore through Thomas's shoulder. The blacksmith roared and charged, swinging his axe with the force of a man who had buried brothers at the hands of men like this. Alina heard the gunfire from miles away and closed her eyes. Please, she thought, let it be enough. It was. By dusk 5 men lay dead, 2 had fled. One Harlan stood on the ridge above, untouched, rifle aimed. You think this ends here? He called out, voice hoarse with rage. Thomas bled beside the blacksmith, both too spent to move. The preacher lay still a few yards down, wounded or worse, they couldn't tell. You made a mistake, Avery, Harlan snarled. You gave that woman a gun, now she thinks she's somebody. Thomas tried to stand, failed, gritted his teeth. Then Harlan turned, and Alina was already behind him. She stepped from the shadows like a ghost born of fire and cold and fury. Her gun was steady, her breath sharp. This somebody, she said, wants her boy back. Harlan turned too fast, too loud. She fired once. He dropped. Thomas didn't see her come down the ridge, only felt her arms around him, firm and shaking. You're hit, she whispered. You too, he said, heart's gone all soft. She laughed, and it sounded like victory. Jacob found them hours later, stumbling back through the brush, lured by the fading echo of gunfire. He saw Alina first and ran to her, wrapping small arms around her waist. I stayed, he said, muffled by her coat. She knelt, brushing hair from his face, and I came back. The preacher was alive, barely, the blacksmith bruised but grinning. The cabin was still standing, though half the porch was burned. They buried Harlan at the edge of the canyon, no marker, no words. The other men who survived, those who'd followed without cruelty, who'd never raised a hand to Jacob, were given a choice: leave or stay and rebuild what they helped break. 2 stayed, quietly, willingly. Guilt had made men out of them. Weeks passed. Snow melted. And slowly the silence in the house turned into something else. Jacob laughed. Alina hummed while she cooked. Thomas whittled at the table, shaping pieces of wood into birds, into horses, into memories. They lived not in fear, but in defiance. They lived with ghosts, but no longer as hosts. One night, Thomas found her on the porch again. You remember why you came? He asked. She nodded. You bought a bride to fill an empty house. He stepped closer, and instead, I found something I didn't think I'd ever have again, she said, eyes shining. A place that feels like home. They didn't kiss, not yet, but their hands found each other's. And held tight. The thaw came slow. It didn't roar in with storms or split the earth with sudden green. It crept, gentle, hesitant. Snow softened to slush along the edges of the cabin, then gave way to wet dirt and shivering blades of grass. The river cracked its icy coat in small sighs at dawn, and by the 3rd week of March, the first birds returned, cautious, like all things that had survived too much. Inside the cabin, the world had changed. Not loudly, not in declarations, but in the way mornings began without tension. In the way Jacob would race outside without looking over his shoulder. In the way Alina sang, quietly, under her breath while stitching together the old quilt that had nearly burned during the siege. In the way Thomas, arms still bound from the wound he'd taken above the ridge, would pause at the door each morning just to watch her brush the boy's hair back from his eyes. There was still pain, yes, wounds that flared in the rain, ghosts that wandered through dreams. But the air no longer carried the weight of waiting for violence. It carried something else now, something softer, something more dangerous. Hope. And it terrified Thomas more than any bullet ever had. He tried to keep his hands busy, mending fences, planting early, chopping wood with one arm while the other ached with protest. But the ache he couldn't shake wasn't in his shoulder. It was the way Alina smiled when she didn't know he was watching. The way she leaned into Jacob like she'd always been meant to belong beside him. The way every part of this thing, the house, the fire, the laughter, felt like a dream he didn't want to wake from. He caught her watching him too sometimes, when he brushed ash from his shirt, when he bent to grab feed. Her eyes lingered a second too long, and once, just once, he caught her touching the ring on her chain, not the one from before, but the one he'd given her when she first arrived. The one neither of them had talked about since. One morning he found her in the pasture, standing by the fence as Jacob tried, awkwardly, earnestly, to saddle a pony that had no interest in cooperating. "He's got more stubborn in him than strength," Thomas muttered as he walked up. "He gets that from you," she said without looking at him. He stopped beside her. "You think this is what normal looks like?" She exhaled. "I stopped looking for normal a long time ago. I just want peace." "You have it," he said. Her eyes didn't leave the field. "Do I?" He turned to her fully. "Eleanor." But whatever words he might have found were swallowed by the sound of hooves, fast, too fast, kicking up dust across the ridge. Thomas stiffened. Eleanor turned, sharp and alert. It was a rider, alone, and he didn't slow. Thomas grabbed the rifle from the porch, already moving. Eleanor stepped in front of Jacob, voice low, steady. "Inside, now." Jacob obeyed without argument. The rider reached them within minutes, his horse slick with sweat, his coat streaked with travel dust. He pulled up hard, boots sliding into the mud, and tore off his hat. It was Eli Cooper, the preacher's boy, barely 20, wide-eyed and shaking. "They're coming," he gasped, "from Branton's Hollow, at least 20. Thomas stepped forward. "You sure?" "I saw the wagon, guns, men I didn't recognize. They're not from around here." Eleanor looked at Thomas, jaw set. "We need to move." "No," Thomas said. "We need to finish this." They spent the day preparing. Again, but this time it was different. They weren't defending a cabin, they were defending a life they'd built together from ash. There was no preacher this time, no blacksmith, just them, and a boy who'd already been taken once. They reinforced the porch, dug lines around the barn, stashed rifles in the hollow of trees. Jacob helped too, not with fear but with quiet, purposeful movements, like he'd decided he wouldn't be taken again, not without a fight. Night fell fast, as it always did when danger waited in the dark. Eleanor sat by the fire, her hands motionless over her lap. "We might not make it this time," she said. Thomas didn't argue. He sat beside her, his voice low. "Do you regret it?" She turned to him. "Regret what?" "This life, this place, me." She stared at him so long he started to wonder if he'd made a mistake speaking. But then she leaned forward, slow, and took his face in her hands. "No," she said. "You gave me back something I thought was gone." "What's that?" She kissed him, not hurried, not desperate, just real. "Me," she whispered. They didn't sleep that night. They took turns at the window, rifles ready, listening, waiting. It was just before dawn when the sound came. Wheels, hooves, voices. Then stillness. And then fire. A torch sailed through the air, crashing against the side of the barn. The roof caught fast, flames licking upward with terrifying speed. Thomas was already moving. Eleanor kicked open the back door, led Jacob out through the trench they'd dug, rifle strapped across her back. The first shots rang out, wild and scattered. Thomas ducked behind the porch post, returning fire. One man fell. Another cursed and ducked behind the wagon. It wasn't war, it was chaos, but chaos with too much planning. These weren't just outlaws. These were hired men, mercenaries. Someone wanted Thomas dead. Someone who hadn't forgotten about Harlan. Someone who'd paid to finish the job. "Flank the left," a voice shouted. Eleanor fired, hit the speaker clean through the thigh. He went down screaming. Smoke thickened. The barn groaned and collapsed. And through it all, Thomas fought like a man who'd already lost everything once. By noon, half the men lay dead or crawling. The rest fled, but not before setting fire to the wagon, not before one bullet found Thomas's side. He fell hard. Eleanor was beside him in seconds. hands pressed to the wound, voice shaking. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare die on me." Jacob hovered behind her, pale and silent. Thomas coughed. "Hurts like hell." "Good," she snapped. "Means you're still alive." They dragged him inside, bandaged what they could, waited. 3 days passed. He didn't wake. On the 4th morning, Alina sat beside him, her fingers curled around his. She'd barely slept. Jacob had taken to sitting on the floor by the bed, book in his lap, eyes never far from Thomas's face. And then he stirred. His eyes opened. Alina gasped, hand to her mouth. "You're real," he rasped. She laughed and wept at once. "Yes, I'm real, and if you ever scare me like that again, I swear I'll kill you myself." He tried to smile, failed. "Still married to me." She leaned close. "I never stopped." Outside, spring finally arrived for real. The birds returned for good. Grass covered the blood-stained ground, and in the yard Jacob learned to ride, alone, steady, proud. Thomas healed slow, but he healed. One morning, as the sun broke over the hills, he stepped out onto the porch, arm around Alina's waist, and watched Jacob gallop across the pasture. "I bought a bride once," he said. Alina leaned into him. "No, you didn't." He looked down at her, confused. "You bought a name," she said, "but what you got?" She kissed his jaw, soft and sure. "Was a partner." And Thomas Avery, for the first time in his life, believed he deserved one. The letter came by writer near the end of May. Dust-covered, plain parchment folded twice and sealed not with wax but twine, a rancher's seal if anything. Alina opened it on the porch while Thomas trimmed the last of the split logs. She didn't speak right away, just let her eyes move across the page with slow, deliberate calm. Thomas noticed the stillness in her shoulders before he noticed anything else. It wasn't fear, it was something harder, older. When she finally handed him the paper, her fingers brushed his just long enough to say, "Don't panic, just read." The message was short, no name, no return address. "We were watching the wrong man, it was never Bishop. You made enemies further back than you knew, southbound riders en route. Tell Avery the past's come due." Thomas read it twice, then again. The name Bishop stuck like a splinter. It should have ended with him. Harlan had been the face of the fire, the cruel hands that stole Jacob, but the mind behind it had never shown itself. Until now. "They're not coming for land," Thomas said at last. "They're coming for blood." Alina nodded. "Yours." For the first time in weeks, Jacob looked afraid. He'd come to trust stillness, to feel safe in the rhythm of a life that no longer hurt. But children always sense the break before it comes. He clung tighter to Alina that evening, shadowing her through the house, pretending not to listen when she and Thomas spoke in low tones by the fire. "Is there anyone else who could have sent this?" she asked. "Too many. A man don't build land this size without stepping on pride," Thomas muttered, "and I was never kind about it." "But you were fair." That never mattered to men who wanted more. They didn't sleep that night. They packed, just enough to move quick but not enough to look like they were running. Alina had no plans to flee. Not again. Not with Jacob now sleeping beside the hearth, one hand still curled around the wooden horse Thomas had carved him weeks ago. Not with the soil finally soft enough to plant. Not when they'd come this far. "We can't keep building just for it to burn," she whispered as dawn crept in through the shutters. Thomas turned to her. "Then we don't run, but we don't wait here either." She looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying if someone out there is counting down to war, maybe it's time we beat them to it." The days that followed moved fast. Thomas rode east to a nearby town called Granger's Well, one he hadn't set foot in since before Alina ever stepped into his life. He left at dawn and returned long after dark, face lined with quiet tension. "You said you were done calling in favors," Alina said as she helped him off the horse. He winced, still sore in the ribs. I lied. Granger's Well was where Thomas had once paid 2 months' wages to keep a widow and her boy from losing their land. It was where he'd once helped an outlaw's sister bury the past without a badge catching wind. Those memories came back now, not with pride but utility, because favors paid out always circled back. And they did. 2 men arrived the next day, both looking older than Thomas remembered. One was a sharpshooter who'd lost 3 fingers and none of his edge. The other, a former deputy who still wore the star, not on his coat, but burned into the leather of his belt like a warning. Neither asked for money. I heard what happened with the boy, the shooter said. Figured it was time I stopped tending chickens and put my rifle to work. The deputy just grunted. Avery once gave me a name when I needed to disappear. Time to return the favor. Jacob watched them with wide eyes, perched on the fence as they unloaded gear and checked the lines around the property. Are they friends? He asked Alina. No, she answered. They're family of a different kind. Meanwhile, Thomas and Alina mapped every blind spot, every turn of the land. They set traps in old creek beds, reinforced the cabin's western wall, and left fresh buckets of water where fire might come. But most of all, they prepared the field. Thomas had long stopped seeing the pasture as just a place for crops. Now it was terrain, cover, and maybe, if needed, a grave. It was on the 5th day that they spotted the first figure. A rider far off, just close enough to catch the glint of something metal, maybe a badge, maybe a gun. By nightfall, 4 more followed. They didn't approach, just lingered on the ridge like crows waiting for something to fall. That evening the air hung heavy. The whole house seemed to breathe slower, quieter, as if holding a final breath before the plunge. Jacob slept in the loft now, where no stray bullet could reach. The 2 men Thomas had called in sat on either side of the porch, rifles across their knees. Alina stood at the kitchen table, cutting strips of cloth for bandages. You should know something, Thomas said, stepping in from the porch. She didn't turn. What? Back before I sent for you, I'd made peace with the idea I'd die alone. She turned slowly, eyes wary. I didn't send for a wife, he continued. I sent for something to fill the silence, but I didn't expect you to be a storm. Her voice cracked soft. Is that a complaint? He stepped closer. No, it's a prayer. Then, for the first time since she arrived, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out something she hadn't seen before, a small, thin band of gold. Not the one that came with her dowry, not the one they'd used for show when the preacher came to make it legal. A new one, handmade, simple, unflawed. I don't want a bride I paid for, he said. I want a partner I fought beside. I want you. Alina stared at the ring, then at him. Then she reached for his hand and slid the ring onto her finger without a word. I'll take that as yes, he said. She kissed him fierce and fast. You better. That night the cabin stood silent as the stars blinked open. No wind, no wolves, just tension like wire strung tight across the land. Then footsteps, not soft, not rushed, just deliberate. Thomas stood. Alina was already moving toward the window. 5 riders dismounting. A 6th figure came forward, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He called out, Avery. Thomas didn't move, just listened. We're not here to burn, the voice continued. Not unless we have to, just want to talk. Thomas stepped out, gun in hand but lowered. Then talk. The man removed his hat. And Thomas's heart nearly stopped. It was his brother. Wade Avery. The one who disappeared 12 years ago with a pocket full of stolen land deeds and a lie in his mouth. The one Thomas had buried in his mind because no man could mourn a snake and still grow. Been a long time, Wade said, his voice calm, but his eyes already scanning the porch, the rifles, the woman beside Thomas's shoulder. Didn't figure you'd end up playing house. You came all this way to insult me. Wade shrugged. I came because your name keeps popping up in places it don't belong. People saying you're soft now, that you built yourself a family. Thomas raised the rifle. I did. And I'm gonna take it, Wade said. He whistled. From behind the trees, more figures emerged. 15, maybe 20. And all of them carried guns. Thomas didn't flinch. Not when Wade raised his hand. Not when the second wave of riders revealed themselves in full, men in gray dusters, horses packed heavy, rifles across backs and belts gleaming with too much metal. Not even when a leaner muttered under her breath, "He brought a militia." He just stood there, calm and steady, one man against 20, heart thudding not from fear, but from the familiar weight of betrayal. "You always did like taking things you didn't earn," Thomas said, rifle still low but eyes sharp. "And you always did act like you were owed more than your share," Wade replied, a crooked smile curling across his weathered face. "That land, that house, that boy, you think I don't hear what folks whisper now when they talk about you? Thomas Avery, good man. Thomas Avery, savior of lost children. Thomas Avery, husband to a bride he bought but who stayed anyway. Makes me sick, Tommy, all of it. You building a life like you got nothing to answer for." "You want this land," Thomas said. "You want the barn and the busted fences, the busted man I used to be. You're welcome to it, but you're not taking my son, and you're not putting a hand on my wife." Alina stepped up beside him at that, firm and unmoving. "I'm not his wife because he paid for me," she said, her voice clear enough for every man in Wade's group to hear. "I'm his wife because when the world broke me, he gave me a place to heal. You think that's something you can steal?" Wade let the smile drop. "I think I can take whatever I want, Alina, always have." He whistled again. The man to Wade's left reached for his rifle. That's when the first shot rang out, not from the porch, but from the pine ridge just beyond the cabin, where the sharpshooter Thomas had called in crouched silent in the brush. The man with the rifle dropped hard, a clean shot, between the eyes. The other men hesitated. Alina didn't. She fired once, hit a man in the leg. Thomas took out another near the fence post, and the deputy from Granger's well appeared like a ghost from the north field, his shotgun booming into the chaos before fading back into the trees. Wade dove for cover, roaring, "Get them all!" Gunfire erupted. It wasn't a battle, it was a storm, cracking and flashing and leaving the air full of smoke and ash. Thomas shouted over the roar, "Alina, to the barn!" "No, back inside, Jacob." He was already sprinting for the door, bullets tearing the air near his feet. One splintered the porch post as he dove inside. Alina ran behind him, breath ragged, her coat catching briefly on a nail before she tore herself free. Inside, Jacob was crouched under the table, eyes wide with terror but jaw clenched. "You okay?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "I'm not scared," he said, though his hands trembled, "just mad." Alina pulled him into her arms and held tight, shielding him from the windows as more shots rang out. Outside, Thomas moved like a man on borrowed time. He'd taken a grazing wound to his thigh, but it didn't slow him. His mind only counted threats, only calculated angles. He dropped 2 more men near the corral, dodged behind the well wall and caught sight of Wade again, retreating back toward the tree line like a coward, shouting orders, not leading them but pushing them ahead like fodder. The shooter on the ridge hit another man near the horses. Screams filled the air. But they kept coming. Then fire. Someone threw a lantern against the side of the cabin. Flames crawled across the roof, hungry and fast. Thomas saw it too late to stop it. He shouted, "Alina." She was already moving, Jacob in her arms, out the back door just as the shingles caught. Thomas ran for them but stumbled, his leg buckling from the wound. He fell hard, catching himself with one arm just as Alina reached him. "I've got you," she hissed, lifting him with raw strength she didn't know she had. "We're not dying in smoke." Behind them the cabin groaned. The roof caved inward. The place where they'd built their life, where he'd first kissed her by firelight, where Jacob had whispered that he wasn't afraid anymore, collapsed in flames. They dragged Thomas behind the barn where the deputy waited, jaw set tight. "We need to end this now," he said. "We're outnumbered, but they don't know we're outgunned." The shooter gave a low whistle from the trees, 2 tones, a signal. "They're circling," he added. "Last chance." Thomas looked at Alina. She nodded. And then they stood, Alina at his side, rifle steady. The deputy flanked them. The sharpshooter picked off men from the far ridge with merciless precision. Thomas, despite the blood darkening his trouser leg, took aim and began firing with methodical calm. Wade's men broke. First in confusion, then in panic. Because this wasn't a battle between equal sides. It was a stand against men who only knew how to take from the weak. And Thomas and Alina weren't weak anymore. Wade screamed from the trees, "Get back here." But they didn't listen. 3 ran, 2 dropped their weapons. The rest melted into the brush, retreating as quickly as they'd come. And Wade. He stayed. Alina saw him rise from the tree line, gun raised, face twisted in rage. She raised hers too, but Thomas stepped in front of her. "This is mine." Alina lowered her rifle, heart pounding. "Wade," Thomas called out, walking forward despite the limp. His brother sneered. "Gonna kill me now, in front of your woman?" "No," Thomas said. "I'm going to give you a choice." Wade hesitated. "Drop it, leave, never come back, or keep raising that gun and die here. Not as a martyr, not as a legend, just another man no one will mourn." For a long second, Wade didn't move. Then his fingers tightened around the grip. Thomas's rifle rose. But the shot didn't come from him. It came from Alina. Wade's gun flew from his hand. He screamed, clutching his wrist. "You don't get to hurt him," Alina said, stepping forward, barrel still smoking. Thomas stared at her, then lowered his own rifle. Wade crumpled to his knees. "You'll bleed out if you don't wrap it," Thomas said. "There's rope near the barn, tie yourself to the fence. Someone will find you." Alina turned to him. "You're letting him live." He already lost. They didn't look back as they walked away, past the rubble of their home, past the blackened earth, past the memories that burned. They only looked ahead, to the ridge where Jacob waited with the deputy, wide-eyed and unblinking. Alina fell to her knees and hugged the boy tight. "We're okay," she whispered. "We're okay." Later they stood among ash. The barn half crumbled, the fence scarred with bullet holes, the air still heavy with smoke and memory. "We lost the house," Jacob said quietly. Thomas crouched beside him. It was just wood. "But that's where we lived." Alina reached down and took both their hands. "We still do, just not in there." They didn't speak much after that, not that day. They buried 3 bodies, 2 men who'd stood beside them and one of Wade's who bled out alone. The rest fled south, and Wade. He was still tied when the sheriff came, still cursing, still wounded. But powerless. In the weeks that followed, neighbors trickled in. People who'd stayed silent during the attack now arrived with timber, with food, with help. Alina led the rebuild. Jacob fetched water and hammered nails with his small hands. And Thomas, he healed. Slowly. Not just in his body, but in the parts that had never been whole to begin with. And when they raised the new beams, stronger, taller, sturdier than before, it wasn't just a cabin. It was a home. Not built on transaction. Not built on silence. But on love. On fire survived. And hearts earned. The new house rose without ceremony. No preacher. No guests. Just hammers, sweat, and hands that had survived the fire. Thomas worked with a limp, Alina with a quiet steadiness, and Jacob with more laughter than he'd ever known before. Piece by piece, they built not just walls but healing. Neighbors who'd stayed silent during the storm now brought lumber, nails, bread. Some stayed to help, others stayed for good. The land, scarred but still theirs, held firm. They called themselves the Averies now, not because a name made it so, but because love had made it true. The day the roof was finished, Thomas stood on the peak and stared at the valley. Everything broken was behind them. Everything whole stretched forward. That night they sat around the new hearth, Thomas, Eleanor, Jacob. No danger, no dread, just warmth. "You ever think about the day I got off that stagecoach?" Eleanor asked, smiling. "Every day," Thomas said. "I didn't plan to stay. I didn't plan to need you." She leaned into him. "And now?" "Now," he said, "I don't know how I ever lived without you." Later, a young woman rode in alone, half-starved and bruised. She asked if this was the place people came when they had nowhere left to go. Eleanor met her eyes and said, "It is now." They gave her a bunk, a meal, a chance. And as dawn broke across the rebuilt roof, Jacob asked if he could one day build his own cabin, just down by the ridge. Thomas smiled. "You will, and when you do, we'll be right here. No more ghosts, no more running. Just family and home."